Okay. See if the microphone works. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okie dokie. Welcome to Dis and Dat Information on the 10th. We're going to try and finish off Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism, and the Politics of Nature, Chapter 6. We can find our place. Surplus and objection. Chapter 6. Today, capitalism increasingly orders the world, not only within spaces of overt production, but also many natural elements that have not been subsumed, commodified, or forced into production at all. Footnote 85. In fact, capitalism organizes very few of the kinds of beings on Earth directly. It's hard to say that those it does are being cared for exactly. Honeybees may not be a threat of extinction, but they still die in large numbers each year. Chickens are the most numerous animals on the planet, but most live miserable lives confined to tiny cages or overcrowded barns. Milk cows are artificially inseminated over and over, only to have their calves taken away as soon as they're born. Still, the usefulness of these beings to capital means that vast resources are poured into their reproduction. By contrast, capital is largely indifferent to the fate of species that are not themselves cash crops, that is, corn, palm oil, wheat, nor livestock, cattle, pigs, and chickens, nor immediately essential to core aspects of production like honeybees. Even today, contra Munzer, the vast number of creatures remain free in that they are unowned, but they are not themselves free in the sense of liberated. They are, we might say, doubly free, that is, free from ownership and free from the care, however violent, that attends it. For if capitalism has remade much of the physical world through intentional absorption, it has remade it even more powerfully through neglectful omission. The intensive cultivation and use of even a tiny subset of the non-human world ripples through the biosphere writ large, as capital reorients ecosystems around a few profitable species. Agriculture diverts the material resources of a given region from the centuries of energy stored in the soil to the glacial melt flowing through rivers into the cultivation of a few kinds of profitable life, that is, corn, wheat, cotton. Useful organisms are extracted from ecosystems, as Troy Vitesse notes, leaving holes in the tightly woven web of life, while surplus matter is dumped into them, disrupting chemical flows and food chains. The effects on the species that capital ignores are wide-ranging. Their habitats are fragmented, their food sources diminished, their migration patterns interrupted, their water sources fouled. Today, 60% of land mammals are livestock, and another 36% are human beings. Only a meager 4% are actual wildlife. As Alexis Pauline Gumbs notes, the endangerment of marine mammals like the near extinction of the vaquita porpoise and Atlantic right whale is what capitalism means on an interspecies scale. Footnote 89. Many forms of life, therefore, constitute what we might call surplus species. The species, organisms, and ecosystems whose capacities are essentially irrelevant to capital and which are therefore left to fend for themselves. They're structurally comparable to those human beings whom Marx described as surplus populations, the masses of people whose labor is superfluous to capital's needs, but who need a job but cannot find one, and who have to find some other way to reproduce their lives. People in this position are subjected to a distinctive form of domination in their own right. Adam Smith counterposes the self-interested mutual cooperation of the butcher, baker, and brewer to the service position of those entirely dependent on others. Oh, damn it. Sorry. Nobody but the beggar, he claims, chooses to depend chiefly on the benevolence of his fellow citizens. However unequal the exchange of labor power for a wage may be, it nonetheless contains an element of reciprocity. The seller of labor power, however desperate, has something that capital needs, and thus something of value to withhold. Those who can't sell their labor, by contrast, lack access to the wage, and thus to everything the wage can buy, even as they remain dependent on markets to access necessary goods. Wageless life, therefore, tends to be precarious. Tanya Murray Lee argues that people in this position are effectively let die. Footnote 91. They must depend on the benevolence of their fellow citizens for survival, and hence they become vulnerable to the arbitrary power of others. This combination of radical market dependence and asymmetrical personal dependence constitutes what I call, that is what Alyssa calls, market abjection. Many of the non-humans that capital doesn't need are in a similar position: precarious, dependent, abject. To be of no interest to capital can be a blessing. Bowhead whale populations rebounded in the Arctic, for example, when commercial whalers finally left them alone. But for many others, perhaps most, capital's disinterest is a death sentence. They are neither raw material nor potential commodity, valuable neither in exchange nor as sources of rent. This does not mean that they are useless to human beings. An estimated 70% of the global poor depend directly on wild species for subsistence, at least in part, meaning that they suffer more directly the loss of ecosystem services. Nearly everyone derives pleasure from unowned and unmanaged beings in some form or another. We all, as the very idea of ecosystem services makes clear, rely on them for basic survival. But however valuable these entities may be as means of subsistence or aesthetic pleasure, or simply in their own right, they struggle to attract interest from the relevant parties, those private investors who can ensure their survival. They are exploited and even annihilated, not by virtue of being incorporated into the market, as in the phenomenon that Kianga Yamhata Taylor describes as predatory inclusion, but by being excluded from it. Footnote 93. While this resembles the phenomenon that Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes as organized abandonment, wherein both capital and states disavow responsibility for land and labor, and for the most part is not actively organized or planned. It is a form of neglect stemming from disinterested exclusion, resulting in disorganized abandonment, another dimension of non-responsibility under capitalism. The problem, then, isn't what it's typically said to be, that capital is commodifying life itself or enclosing the last remaining commons. Most forms of life almost certainly won't be commodified. Some seemingly can't be. What is most damning in this situation is not the condition of being subjected to instrumental use or even lacking use value, but that of being useless to capital in particular. The results are often violent, even brutal, but this violence is of a distinctive kind. It is not the overt destruction associated with processes like whaling or logging, but rather the accidental byproduct of ostensibly bloodless economic processes. Next section, states of nature. If capital won't provide ecosystems and their services, who will? At least since Adam Smith, the answer to the problem of underprovided public goods has been the state. The role of the state, Smith argues, is to provide goods and services that are socially valuable, but not privately profitable. The state's role, in other words, is to solve capital's collective action problem, to coordinate what capital proves unable to on a scale beyond what any individual firm or household could manage. Are there no workhouses? If this constitutes a frank acknowledgement that capital is parasitic, or at least reliant on other institutions and agents, it is also fairly run-of-the-mill. Even Friedrich Hayek, in his notoriously anti-state polemic, The Road to Serfdom, acknowledges that the state has a legitimate role in providing what the market cannot, including notably a substitute for the regulation by the price mechanism to address, quote, certain harmful effects of deforestation or of some methods of farming, close quote. 96. Indeed, for all the critical attention devoted to the rapacious energies of capital and markets, it is the state that has been the driving force behind efforts to constitute nature as capital. It is the state that initially undertook assessments of ecological value for use in cost-benefit analyses of public programs, and that has devised strategies for incorporating the estimated value of nature into national accounts. It is the state that has funded most ecosystem service conservation outright, paid people to steward ecosystems, and administered funds supplied by multilateral institutions. It is the state, too, that has engineered and administered the banner examples of ecosystem services in action, from the preservation of the New York City watershed as a water filtration device to Costa Rica's conservation of wide swaths of forest. For that matter, most so-called markets in ecosystem services are really just misleadingly labeled regulations or subsidies, in which states set targets or offer incentives to producers who adopt ecologically sustainable practices, footnote 99. Where actual markets in ecosystem services do exist, states play an outsized role in them. They not only create, reorganize, and enforce property rights, as all markets require, but create demand itself through regulations that require the purchase of the likes of carbon credits. Because payments for ecosystem services are essentially rents, as Romain Faley notes, they are contingent on control over resources and ultimately on the state's power over territory. Footnote 100. Smith's classic examples of the goods that states should provide are infrastructure elements like bridges and roads. Many ecosystems, too, are better understood as infrastructures than commodities, as the foundations beneath value-generating activity rather than the sources of value in themselves. Footnote 101. Infrastructure is a formal category defined in relation to the activities it supports. As the trajectory from Smith to Hayek makes clear, state provision of infrastructure does not necessarily constitute a challenge to capitalism, and is indeed often undertaken to facilitate capital investment. Indeed, in capitalist societies, the category of infrastructure tends to signify areas where the market fails to provide goods that are widely recognized as useful and even necessary. It designates unproductive expenditures that capital is unlikely to produce. The state often operates as a paracapitalist agent doing things capital needs but can't do for itself. If ecosystemic infrastructures, like built ones, are often oriented towards facilitating production and accumulation, toward protecting what James O'Connor calls the conditions of production, they might also be oriented toward sustaining human and non-human life regardless of their contributions to accumulation, toward supporting what O'Connor describes as means of life, and Winona LaDuke and Deborah Cohen describe as alimentary infrastructures. Footnote 103. A wetland, for example, might be preserved in order to provide a waste management facility for a nearby industrial plant or to provide habitat for local waterfowl and flood protection to nearby towns. A watershed might be preserved as part of the water filtration infrastructure for a multinational beverage corporation or as a source of fresh water for nearby residents. A prairie might be managed for cattle ranching, with wolves eliminated and wild horses culled or rewilded to support a wider range of species. Footnote 104. If the role of the state in providing ecosystem services does not signify a break with capital, then it does signal productive tensions. Capital's reliance on the state to provide at least some of the things it needs opens a political door, one that might lead to more overt battles over control of investment. Although the state is often inclined to provide what capital needs, its actions are never driven only by value in the way that capitals are. A key condition, then, is whether and under what conditions the state will secure means of life that are not also conditions of production. To understand ecosystem services as public services, in other words, is to open them up to public and political contestation. It raises the question, who benefits from nature's gifts and to what purposes are they put? Perhaps more significantly, the state's role in making natural capital marks an acknowledgement that some things simply will not be valued on capital's terms and must be assessed in other ways. We're used to evaluating the worth of commodities in exchange. But because the free gifts of nature don't appear in the market, they can only be evaluated politically. The free gift of nature, as I have argued, is a real abstraction. It is the way we tend to treat and value nature by default. It reflects not a conscious decision to value nature at zero or an active process of reasoning, but an outcome of our actions and relationships, something we do unwittingly. Footnote 106. Natural capital, by contrast, understood as an effort to assert the economic value of ecological nature, is an artificial abstraction. It is a category that does not have self-sustaining force in the world, one that cuts against the real abstractions generated by exchange under conditions of market rule, and which therefore must be constantly asserted and enforced. Footnote 107. Artificial abstractions are not false or imaginary any more than real abstractions are true or natural. They can have real force in the world, but their construction and deployment are laborious in a way that the real abstractions are not and more prone to failure. These forms of valuation must be consciously undertaken and constantly reinforced, almost nearly always by the artificial man of the state. Footnote 108. As such, artificial abstractions often seem like an intrusion into voluntary social practices or distortions of spontaneous order. In my view, this is their great virtue. Artificial abstractions reveal the political questions lurking within prices, the many kinds of value that the value form neglects. They force the question of value from the realm of unthinking action to that of conscious reflection. Although decades of efforts to make nature into capital have failed to make prices stick, then they have successively brought to light the questions that are nearly always disguised beneath prices. The extremity of the disjuncture between what nature's value should be and what it is, thus presents a particularly acute portrait of capitalism's general mismanagement of wealth, or mismeasurement of wealth, I'm sorry. It poses a similar question to that raised by the devaluation of reproductive labor. If the planetary processes that constitute the bases of life on Earth itself are not valued at all, why would we expect capitalism to value anything else as we think it should? The recognition that decisions about nature's value must be made politically rather than in the market thus allows us to revisit the core question of the ecological ethics debate. That is, what is an ecosystem worth in a different register? And yes, the conclusion: conscious planet making. Planetary ecosystems are presently in a dire state. For decades, capitalism has proposed to hold the solutions in new forms of property rights, new kinds of markets, new representations of concrete natures in abstract terms. Public, private, and nonprofit sectors have constructed an elaborate labyrinth of social and economic institutions, in the words of the geographer Eric Swingdow, a truly Stalinist bureaucratic institutional structure in service of making nature into credits, capitals, or assets, buying and selling ecosystem services, pricing nature to save it. Footnote 109. Recent speculations about markets and natural assets are only the most recent iteration of a dream, now over 3 decades old, of unlocking the wealth that nature's free gifts seem to hold. Footnote 110. So far, however, its realization remains elusive. Making ecosystems into revenue-generating property, let alone growth-stimulating assets, is, as we have seen, enormously complicated and rarely successful. Actually protecting ecosystem services, however, is much simpler. For the most part, it just means preserving swaths of land large enough to keep ecological relations intact, and then leaving them alone. Ecosystems are, in a sense, already socialized. Insofar as their physical qualities resist the relations of private ownership, they are already automated in that they largely work on their own, with a bit of maintenance here and there. Why work so hard to make them monopolizable by private interests instead of embracing them as a public good? Why, put simply, should the state go to so much trouble to privatize and capitalize nature instead